They went on an expedition through the Amazon when their drone detected something metallic beneath a thick jungle canopy. Pushing through the dense forest, they found an old World War II plane wedged between massive trees. But what they saw inside made them scream in terror. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The helicopter faded into the distance, its echo dissolving into the humid haze that rose like smoke from the endless green expanse of the Amazon basin. Jamal Carter stood motionless, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack, feeling the heavy pulse of the jungle around him. Every sound was alive. The shrill chorus of cicadas, the muffled drip of condensation falling from the canopy above, the rasp of air itself thick with life. For a moment, he simply breathed it in. The sweet rot of vegetation, the musky dampness of the soil, and felt small, like a single molecule swallowed by something ancient and vast. Beside him, Marcus Ellis checked the satellite coordinates on his wrist GPS, the tiny screen flickering with erratic signals. They had been warned that deep inside this region, technology faltered. The forest itself seemed to bend frequencies, swallow compasses, and alter direction. Their journey had begun as a simple expedition, a grant-funded field study meant to catalog lichen colonies thriving in high canopy environments. Both men were biologists, friends since university days, drawn together by a shared fascination for the boundary between life and decay. Jamal specialized in plant symbiosis, the quiet partnerships that allowed trees and moss to thrive together. Marcus was an entomologist, a restless observer of the restless. Ants, beetles, dragonflies, and every form of crawling intelligence that defined the forest's rhythm. Their grant came from a research consortium at the University of Atlanta, paired with a Brazilian institute that promised access to remote territories few outsiders ever reached. What awaited them, however, was something no one could have imagined or sanctioned. They set camp near a dry rise of land where the ground held firm beneath the trees. The air was dense, the light subdued by the thick quilt of leaves above. The trunks stretched upward like cathedral pillars, and in the silence between gusts of wind, Jamal felt as though the forest were breathing, a subtle expansion and contraction that matched the rhythm of his own lungs. As they unpacked equipment, he noticed how even their metal tools began to tarnish within hours, coated with a fine layer of green condensation. Marcus marked trees along the perimeter with bright ribbons, creating a fragile human geometry in a place that resisted order. For the first day, they followed the plan. Drone surveys, sampling of moss clusters, detailed humidity readings, and the daily ritual of preserving everything in labeled vials. Their goal was to study vertical biodiversity, the distribution of plant life across different layers of height, and to map relationships between fungus, bark, and light exposure. It was patient, meticulous work, the kind that demanded concentration more than excitement. Yet, as the sun dropped behind the immense curtain of foliage, something unsettled Jamal. The canopy shimmered strangely, as though metal threads were woven among the branches. That evening, Marcus launched a drone to gather a panoramic map. On the monitor, they watched the small machine climb, spinning higher and higher through the green labyrinth. The live feed flickered, glitched, and then returned. What they saw made both men lean closer. In one frame, barely visible between leaves, was a linear reflection, a gleam too perfect to belong to bark or vines. Jamal froze the image, zoomed in, and saw what looked unmistakably like the edge of a wing, smooth and metallic, entangled in vines thick as rope. At first, they thought it might be an abandoned cargo plane, a relic from the decades when smugglers used the forest as refuge. But the shape looked too narrow, too symmetrical. Marcus checked the GPS marker, but the signal dropped to 0. The drone's compass began to spin wildly before the feed cut out entirely. The jungle, dense and secretive, had swallowed it. Night fell without a true sunset. The light faded upward, turning from green to black, while the air seemed to close around them like water. Insects began their chaotic symphony. From somewhere high above, a low hum vibrated. Not mechanical, not animal, but steady, as if a sheet of metal were catching the breeze. Jamal thought it was his imagination, the echo of the missing drone, yet the sound grew deeper. Marcus shone his flashlight upward, but the beam dissolved in mist. The air carried the scent of resin and something faintly electric. They slept lightly, if it could be called sleep at all. The forest moved in cycles of noise and silence, and in every pause Jamal sensed eyes watching from the darkness. He dreamed of vast roots crawling through the soil like veins, of trees breathing and whispering in languages older than wind. When he awoke before dawn, the air was cold, and his equipment bag was wet with condensation. He glanced at the drone controller lying beside him. Its screen flickered once, unprompted, then went black again. Marcus emerged from his hammock, muttering about the constant hum in his ears. He blamed mosquitoes, but Jamal wasn't sure. He decided to check the coordinates where the drone's feed had last transmitted. He replayed the frozen frame on his tablet, the gleaming wing half hidden in vines, and enhanced the image once more. Faintly visible beneath layers of dirt and plant growth, there was writing. Not symbols, not random letters, but clean block text. U.S. Army. The realization struck him like a pulse through the spine. A World War II aircraft here, suspended 50 meters above the forest floor, trapped like an insect in amber. The discovery was improbable, almost absurd. But the Amazon was a graveyard of forgotten endeavors, crashed expeditions, lost mining crafts, even wartime flights rumored to have vanished during storm patrols. Still, the notion that such a relic could survive aloft among living trees seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was there. The wing had merged with the canopy. Nature had not only buried the wreckage but embraced it, making it part of itself. For the rest of the morning, the two men debated their next step. Returning to base camp to report was protocol, but the coordinates were too remote for any rescue or transport team to reach quickly. Curiosity, that ancient fault of every explorer, won out. Marcus prepared a climbing route on the map, estimating elevation and trunk spacing. Jamal checked ropes, carabiners, and harnesses. They both knew the risk. Unstable branches, hidden insects, and the sheer height of the canopy could end their mission in seconds. Yet, something in the forest seemed to invite them upward, whispering with every rustle of leaves. By midday they began their approach. The air grew thicker, the sun fractured into shards that barely pierced the upper leaves. They followed the faint path of their drone's last descent, a corridor of bent vines, crushed ferns, and disturbed insects. Occasionally, Jamal glimpsed reflections through the trees, flashes of dull silver where moss met metal. The closer they came, the stronger the faint hum became, like a low-frequency echo beneath the earth. They reached a cluster of massive kiba trees, their roots like the foundations of ancient temples. Looking up, Jamal could finally see it fully. A plane's fuselage wedged horizontally between two titanic trunks, wrapped in vines and moss, yet unmistakably whole. The sunlight glinted off the wing, revealing fragments of faded paint, the ghost of a white star against gray metal. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. Marcus exhaled first, shaking his head slowly. That thing shouldn't be here, he whispered more to himself than to Jamal, though the words were swallowed by the forest before they reached his ears. Jamal didn't answer. He simply stared upward, mind already mapping the geometry of ascent, the anchor points, the distance between trunks, the angles for rope placement. Logic and disbelief wrestled inside him, but awe prevailed. The forest breathed again, this time louder. A breeze moved through the leaves, and the old aircraft seemed to sigh in response, metal groaning softly as if alive. The vines creaked, and a faint flake of rust drifted down, landing on Jamal's arm like a tiny ember. The symbol of the U.S. Army shimmered faintly beneath the layer of moss. Whatever story this plane carried, it had slept for decades among roots and rain, waiting for someone to find it. When dusk came, they retreated to their camp to plan the climb. Marcus recorded a brief log in his field journal. Coordinates, altitude estimate, visible damage, and the simple note, object stable but unnatural in placement. Jamal stared at the flickering campfire, listening to the drone of insects blending with the forest's breath. In the wavering glow, he saw shapes shifting above, branches swaying against the dim sky like the ribs of a colossal creature. Somewhere beyond the reach of firelight, something metallic reflected faintly again, steady, deliberate, as if the jungle itself acknowledged their discovery. The night deepened into a tapestry of sound, each layer folding into another, frogs croaking like distant engines, birds crying in short mechanical bursts, wind moaning through hollow trunks. The rhythm was almost hypnotic, and in its cadence, Jamal imagined he could hear the slow heartbeat of the forest itself. He wondered if the metal that slept above them had changed the ecosystem somehow, if the jungle had grown around it deliberately, adapting to its presence. Perhaps the plane was no longer a foreign body. It had become part of a living organism, woven into roots and veins, a relic absorbed by time. When he finally closed his eyes, exhaustion overcame thought. His last image was of the canopy far above, glowing faintly silver in the moonlight. He did not see the faint pulse that rippled through the vines near the fuselage, nor the way a few leaves quivered without wind, as though something inside the metal carcass had sensed the warmth of nearby life. The forest continued to breathe. The air vibrated softly, deep within the endless maze of green, and somewhere among those towering trees, the ghost of an old machine waited patiently for dawn. The morning broke heavy and pale, the sky veiled in mist that glowed like milk through the canopy. Dew clung to every surface, and the air was so thick it seemed to press on their skin. Jamal and Marcus moved with slow precision, their boots sinking into spongy moss, careful not to disturb the delicate ecosystem that surrounded them. Overnight, their decision had crystallized into action. They were going to climb to the aircraft that hung between the trees. Neither spoke about the danger. The silence itself carried agreement. The climb would be brutal. The trees that held the plane were massive, ancient ceibas whose roots rose taller than a man's height before vanishing into the earth like the foundations of a buried cathedral. Their branches intertwined far above, supporting the impossible structure. It wasn't clear how the aircraft had ended up there. Perhaps it had clipped the canopy decades ago, snagged between trunks before falling completely. Or perhaps the jungle itself had grown around it, weaving the metal into its fabric. The idea lingered in Jamal's mind as he checked his ropes and fastened his harness. Marcus adjusted the tension of the primary line, securing it around a thick root that protruded from the ground. His movements were mechanical, careful. They had both climbed before. Field expeditions often required scaling trees, but never at such height, never towards something that defied time itself. The forest seemed to disapprove of their intrusion. Birds circled high above, their cries sharp and warning. Every rustle felt amplified, every sound deliberate. By midday, the mist began to thin. Sunlight filtered through the trees, broken into shards that glittered across the metallic body suspended 50 meters above. Jamal felt a shiver of awe each time the light struck it. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a monument, a forgotten relic frozen mid-fall. The vines that enveloped it looked like veins, pulsing with life. He thought of it as a living tomb, one that had traded air currents for branches and silence. They reached the base of the cebas and began their ascent. The bark was rough, warm to the touch, alive with the colonies of ants that scattered beneath their hands. They moved methodically, setting anchors, testing knots, advancing inch by inch. Every movement sent a soft creak through the web of ropes. Marcus led the climb, his muscles moving in rhythm, his breathing steady. Jamal followed close behind, feeling both trust and tension in every pull. Halfway up, they paused on a natural platform formed by intersecting branches. From there, Jamal looked down and saw the forest floor vanish into a dark, rippling sea of green. Above, the plane loomed like a fossilized beast, caught in the act of falling. The closer they came, the more details emerged. Rust streaked the fuselage in long orange tears. Moss had colonized every seam. The faded paint still bore the faint outline of a white star within a blue circle, the insignia of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Marcus reached the underside first, his boot scraping against the metal hull. The sound echoed strangely, hollow yet resonant, as if the plane itself exhaled. He positioned himself against the curvature of the fuselage, examining it closely. The metal was corroded but intact. The trees had fused with it, their roots curling through the open spaces of broken panels, creating a lattice that supported its weight. "It's stable," Marcus murmured, though his voice trembled slightly. Jamal could hear it through the intercom of their helmets. They circled slowly along the fuselage until they reached a section that once had been a cargo hatch. The main door was jammed shut, sealed by decades of oxidation. Only the emergency exit near the cockpit remained slightly ajar, wedged open by a thick vine. Jamal's hands ached from the climb, but he forced his fingers around the edge, testing it. It refused to move. He and Marcus exchanged a nod, then began the slow process of prying it loose with a climbing pick. The metal groaned as if protesting. Flakes of rust drifted down like reddish snow. When the hatch finally gave way, a gust of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of oil, decay, and something faintly metallic, like wet iron mixed with soil. Jamal steadied himself and shone his flashlight inside. The beam sliced through darkness, revealing a narrow corridor that slanted slightly downward. Everything inside was coated in dust and mold, yet the structure had resisted complete ruin. Seats lined the wall, their fabric rotted to threads. Control cables dangled from the ceiling. In the dim light, the interior looked less like a cockpit and more like a tomb preserved by nature. They entered slowly, one after the other, careful not to disturb the fragile balance that held the wreck in place. The air inside was heavy, unmoving. Marcus swept his light across the cockpit, tracing shattered glass and corroded dials. The control panel had fused into a single mass of rust and moss. A bird's nest lay where the pilot's headrest once was. The control yoke, half-eaten by time, bore fingerprints etched into corrosion, a trace of human presence that refused to disappear. Jamal moved toward the rear compartment, stepping over debris that cracked underfoot. Fragments of plastic, scraps of uniform cloth, pieces of wire, all relics of a moment frozen mid-disaster. The silence was suffocating. The forest outside hummed, but inside the plane there was only the soft hiss of their breathing. The flashlight beam caught a metallic glint at the far end of the corridor. It was a small plaque fixed to the wall. Project Albatross, classified cargo. The words were faded but legible. Beneath them, another inscription, almost invisible under grime: "Do not open without authorization." Marcus knelt, brushing the letters with his glove. "Military research transport," he muttered. "Mid-1940s by the looks of it." Jamal didn't respond. His eyes followed the faint outlines of sealed crates stacked against the wall of the cargo bay. Some were crushed under the weight of time, but others looked untouched, perfectly rectangular under a thin skin of vines. Each bore a faded stencil, numbers, serial codes, and the recurring abbreviation C9. A faint vibration ran through the floor beneath them. At first, Jamal thought it was his imagination, but Marcus froze too. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, a deep resonance within the hull, as if metal were remembering movement. The trees swayed slightly outside, and sunlight flickered through cracks in the fuselage, creating a kaleidoscope of gold and green across the dusty walls. The entire structure seemed alive. They spent hours documenting every visible detail. Jamal took photographs of the plaques, the markings, the sealed containers. Marcus recorded dimensions and positions, muttering scientific notes under his breath to distract himself from the eerie stillness. Every so often, a droplet of water fell from above, echoing like a slow heartbeat. When the time came to descend, the forest had already darkened into an early twilight. They secured their ropes again and stepped out onto the wing, testing the tension before moving toward the main trunk. From that vantage point, Jamal looked down and saw how completely the jungle had devoured the remnants of human creation. The aircraft was a scar in the living organism of the forest, and yet it belonged to it now, wrapped and sustained by roots that kept it from falling. As they began their descent, a strange sound followed them, a low creak, then a subtle hum. Jamal looked up just in time to see the vines around the fuselage tighten, as if the trees themselves were adjusting to new weight. A flake of rust fell past his shoulder. The forest, it seemed, was aware of them. They reached the ground exhausted, their hands raw, their clothes damp with sweat and resin. The camp awaited them like an island of order amid chaos. Marcus sat beside the portable stove, staring into the flame while Jamal transcribed notes. Between them lay the camera with the day's photographs, evidence of something beyond comprehension. As the firelight flickered, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been watching them the entire time. The vines around the plane had moved. He was sure of it. Or perhaps it was merely the wind, the illusion of life in a place so dense with motion that nothing ever truly stood still. Yet, as he drifted toward sleep, the faint hum returned, softer now, almost tender, as though the old metal above them had begun to breathe along with the forest. Dawn would bring new choices, whether to report the discovery, to study it further, or to leave it untouched. But deep down, Jamal knew retreat was no longer possible. Whatever had been trapped among the leaves for 80 years had woken at their arrival, and the forest, ancient, patient, alive, was no longer just the backdrop of their expedition. It had become part of the story. And high above, the forgotten plane creaked again, shifting slightly in its cradle of green, as if preparing to reveal what it had guarded for decades. The next morning arrived heavy with mist that pressed against the canopy like a living weight. Jamal woke first, his clothes still damp from the night before, the jungle around him vibrating with the endless hum of insects. He sat for a long time without moving, listening to the low pulse of the forest. Every sound, every tremor felt heightened, as if the air itself had changed since their climb. The image of the plane suspended among the ceiba trees refused to leave his mind. He could still feel the metallic chill of its hull through his gloves, the way it seemed to breathe when the wind moved through the vines. There had been something unnatural about that stillness, something that felt as though time itself had stopped inside it. Marcus stirred beside him, bleary-eyed and tense. His first words were practical, almost defensive. They needed to catalog, to verify, to finish what they had begun. Science demanded precision, and documentation would make sense of what instinct could not. They checked their notes, packed climbing gear, and ate in silence. The fire's smoke curled slowly upward, vanishing into the mist like a whisper of warning. Neither man spoke of the faint hum they'd heard inside the fuselage the day before. It hung between them, unacknowledged but undeniable. By midday, the forest had darkened again, clouds gathering low enough to blur the line between tree and sky. The climb back to the wreck was slower this time, the air heavier, the bark slick with moisture. Every movement demanded balance and patience. The ropes, still secured from the previous ascent, glistened with dew like strands of spider silk. Marcus led the way, occasionally pausing to recheck his anchors, while Jamal followed, his gaze fixed upward. Through the shifting light, he could see the dull silver curve of the aircraft emerging once more from the green maze, a phantom waiting in the canopy. When they reached the hatch, it was exactly as they had left it, slightly ajar, the edges rusted, vines draped across the opening. Yet something was different. The air that seeped out felt colder, the smell sharper, as though the jungle's heat had not dared to enter. Jamal climbed inside first, his flashlight cutting through the stale dark. The beam illuminated motes of dust that floated like slow snow. Every surface was covered in a thin film of decay, but beneath it all, the shape of the interior remained almost perfectly preserved. It was as if time had paused here, frozen at the instant before catastrophe. They moved cautiously, mindful of the fragile structure. The corridor slanted downward toward the rear, and the metal underfoot creaked with each step. The sound echoed faintly through the hollow hull, a metallic heartbeat buried under layers of silence. The cockpit loomed ahead, a chamber of broken glass and twisted metal. The pilot's seat was torn from its bolts, lodged against the control panel. Moss had crept over the dials like a green skin, hiding their numbers but not their purpose. The radio unit was shattered, its wires dangling like veins. Jamal's beam passed over the co-pilot's seat, and for an instant he imagined he saw the faint outline of a human form pressed into the decaying fabric, an impression that vanished as he blinked. Marcus knelt near the central console, brushing away debris. Beneath the grime, faint markings were still visible, a series of hand-drawn coordinates scrawled in pencil. They traced a flight path that curved south, then abruptly cut off. Next to it, a note read, "Change course, unstable cargo, avoid populated zones." The handwriting trembled, rushed, the final letters smeared. Marcus photographed it, his gloved hands shaking slightly. They knew something was wrong. he murmured. Jamal said nothing, only listened to the creak of the fuselage as if the old metal itself were remembering that final descent. They advanced toward the cargo section, where sealed crates filled the narrow space from wall to wall. The air was thick here, heavier, as if every breath drew in the memory of decades. The light revealed rows of military markings, faded yet legible enough to piece together, serial codes, shipment numbers, and a stenciled phrase repeated across several containers, Bio Lot ALBS. On one of them, a large black stamp read Project Albatross Classified Cargo. The words sent a ripple through Jamal's chest. Albatross, the same name engraved on the plaque they'd seen yesterday. It was not just a transport plane. It had been part of a mission, one deliberately concealed from history. The crates were sealed with bolts corroded to a dull orange. Some were broken open, their contents lost to time, but others remained intact. Marcus brushed at one with his glove and frowned. "Look," he said, pointing to a thin line along the edge. The metal had warped in a perfect circle, as though it had been melted, not corroded. The surface shimmered faintly under the flashlight's beam, reflecting colors that shifted with the angle. Silver, then green, then blue. Jamal crouched beside him, touching it carefully. The texture felt smooth, unnaturally so, as if the metal were layered with something organic. In one corner of the compartment, a smaller crate had split open, revealing a glint of glass. Inside was a cylindrical container, cracked but still sealed, half filled with a viscous amber liquid. Something floated within it, an object with structure, like the folded wings of an insect encased in resin. Jamal raised the light closer. It was not a fragment or a trick of reflection. It was a preserved specimen, delicate yet unmistakably mechanical in form. The wings bore a lattice of fine metallic filaments that shimmered faintly even after decades of isolation. Marcus exhaled slowly. "What the hell were they carrying?" he whispered, but the forest outside swallowed his words. Jamal reached for his camera, documenting the find. Each flash illuminated the space in stark bursts of light and shadow, momentarily revealing more details. Scorched marks along the walls, the remnants of a control panel with unfamiliar dials, a small locker labeled crew logs. He tried the handle. It resisted, then gave way with a snap. Inside, wrapped in what was left of waterproof fabric, was a single ledger. The cover bore the emblem of the United States Army Air Forces and the date, December 1944. They carried the book into the cockpit, where the light was stronger. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink had survived. The entries were terse, military, routine at first, fuel records, weather reports, altitude logs. Then, as the pages turned, the tone shifted. One entry near the end was underlined twice. Cargo C9 compromised, structural breach detected, containment holding but unstable. Orders, divert to nearest clearing, no radio contact. The handwriting changed after that, sharper, erratic, as if written in haste. The final note, dated December the 27th, read simply, "No safe landing. Jungle below. God help us." Jamal read it aloud softly, the words filling the confined air. Neither spoke for a while afterward. The jungle murmured outside, steady and eternal, as if mocking the desperation trapped in those pages. Marcus traced the words with his thumb, staring at the phrase, Cargo C9. He looked up, meeting Jamal's eyes. "It's the same code on those containers. Whatever was in them caused the crash." Jamal nodded slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. Biological weapons, experimental technology, secret medical research. The war had birthed 1,000 projects lost to secrecy and shame. Perhaps this was one of them, something never meant to reach the world beyond. They worked in silence, cataloging what they could. Hours slipped by unnoticed, measured only by the fading daylight that filtered through the fuselage cracks. The air grew colder as evening approached. Jamal noticed condensation forming on the sealed containers, droplets that slid across the surface and vanished as if absorbed. The jungle outside seemed to draw closer. Vines brushed the fuselage, tapping against the metal with the steady rhythm of rain, though the air was dry. He could almost believe the forest was listening. As they prepared to leave, Marcus paused near the cracked cylinder with the strange winged specimen. He crouched low, shining his light through the amber fluid. The wings shimmered again, brighter this time, reflecting patterns like circuitry. For an instant, Jamal thought he saw a flicker of movement inside, a subtle ripple through the liquid as if the thing had twitched in its sleep. He blinked and it was gone. But his heart was pounding, every instinct urging him to turn away. They sealed the hatch carefully and began their descent in near darkness. The forest was waiting below, thick and silent. By the time they reached the ground, night had fallen completely. Their campfire cast weak light against the walls of trees, flickering like a heartbeat. They sat side by side, saying little, each lost in his own thoughts. Jamal wrote in his field journal by the dim glow of a lantern, recording the serial codes, the contents, the coordinates. When he looked up, Marcus was staring into the darkness beyond the fire, his face pale with exhaustion. "I keep thinking about them," Marcus said finally. "The crew. They must have known they wouldn't make it." His voice trembled slightly. Jamal nodded, closing the journal. "They didn't just crash," he said quietly. "They were trying to keep something from spreading." The jungle answered with a low groan, the sabas swaying as though breathing again. Above them, high in the canopy, a faint metallic echo drifted through the air, like the distant sigh of an old machine remembering its purpose. Sleep came slowly that night. The forest's chorus had shifted, quieter now, yet filled with subtle vibrations that resonated in their bones. Jamal lay awake, staring at the silver haze between branches, replaying the image of the shimmering wings inside that cracked cylinder. It had looked too perfect to be natural, too organic to be entirely artificial. The line between life and invention had blurred, and he could not shake the feeling that whatever they had uncovered was not merely preserved, it was waiting. When his eyes finally closed, he dreamed of the aircraft rising again, breaking free from the vines, its hollow body glowing from within. The forest swayed around it like waves, leaves trembling with electric light. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the dream dissolving into the steady whisper of wind. Marcus was already awake, staring upward, his face unreadable. Neither spoke, but both knew that today they would have to return to the cargo hold, not as explorers, but as witnesses to something that had survived too long in silence. The jungle stretched around them, vast and endless, the scent of rain and metal thick in the air. Above, the forgotten plane rested in its cradle of branches, untouched yet alive, guarding its secret beneath the endless breathing canopy. The sun did not rise so much as bleed through the fog that morning, casting the forest in shades of dull silver and gray. Jamal felt it before he saw it, the weight of something watching, something vast yet silent, draped over the canopy like a breath too heavy to exhale. He had slept little, haunted by the image of the cracked cylinder and its gleaming wings frozen inside amber liquid. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faint shimmer ripple through it, as though the thing within had felt their presence. When Marcus finally stirred, his expression was tight, his eyes bloodshot from lack of rest. They both knew without speaking that they would go back up. The climb was slower this time, deliberate and tense. The ropes they had left overnight were slick with condensation, and every knot had to be checked and retied. The ceibas were damp and alive beneath their hands, their trunks breathing faintly with the pulse of water rising through roots. Even the insects seemed quieter than before, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. When they reached the fuselage, the air that seeped from the open hatch was cold again, unnaturally so, like the inside of a long-sealed cave. The scent of rust and oil had deepened, mingled now with something faintly sweet, almost chemical. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt altered. The light from their headlamps refracted strangely off the metal walls, as if the air were thicker. The crates stood in their same silent formation, but the condensation had grown heavier, the droplets larger and trembling like dew before a storm. Jamal went first to the cracked cylinder. The fluid inside was darker now, clouded near the bottom, and when he leaned close, he swore he saw movement again. A slow drift not from air or gravity but from intention. Marcus unpacked the portable equipment they had carried up. A small sterilized case, sealed bags, and a roll of reflective sheeting to create a barrier between them and the rest of the cargo. They were scientists still, though their hands trembled as they worked. Jamal set up a tripod for his camera, adjusting the angle so every step would be recorded. Marcus examined the container's locking mechanism, tracing the corrosion with a thin brush. "Outer casing only," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying in the stagnant air. "We don't breach the inner seal." Jamal nodded. It was an agreement born not of courage but of fear. The operation took nearly an hour. Each bolt protested like a voice, groaning as it gave way. The moment the final screw came loose, a faint hiss escaped, cold and metallic. A wave of chilled air rolled over them and their breath became visible. The forest outside was humid and warm, yet within the fuselage the temperature had dropped to near freezing. They peeled back the outer shell carefully, revealing a layer of transparent composite beneath, slick with condensation. Through it, they could see the amber core more clearly now. Inside, the winged figure glowed faintly, its structure crystalline, its eyes like twin pearls suspended in resin. Marcus leaned close, examining the texture under ultraviolet light. The wings shimmered, their metallic veins pulsing faintly, as though reflecting some rhythm neither man could hear. Under magnification, Jamal noticed the surface was not smooth. It was made up of microscopic hexagonal cells, each one reflecting light differently, forming a pattern too complex to be random. The specimen was mechanical, yet unmistakably biological in design. He realized then that they were not looking at an insect at all. It was something constructed to mimic life, an engineered organism from an age when such technology should not have existed. They documented every detail. The symbols etched faintly into the metal near the base of the capsule, the irregularities in the seal, the strange luminescence that seemed to intensify the longer they watched. Each minute stretched. The hum they had heard before returned, low and steady, emanating from the container itself. The light quivered in sync with it, like a heartbeat buried under layers of metal and time. Then came the vibration. It was subtle at first, a tremor through the floor that made the dust shift in small ripples. Marcus froze, his gloved hand hovering above the capsule. The vibration grew stronger, and a sound like the slow turn of an engine echoed from the rear of the cargo bay. Jamal turned sharply, his flashlight darting across the crates. For an instant, he thought he saw something on the walls, fine filaments spreading like frost, shimmering as they crawled outward from the containers. When he blinked, they were gone. "We need to stop," Marcus said, his voice tight. "It's destabilizing." But Jamal shook his head, transfixed by the thing before them. The hum deepened, resonating through his chest. It was not just sound. It was communication, a pulse he could feel in his bones. He reached out almost without realizing it, placing his palm lightly against the transparent casing. It was cold, impossibly cold. Beneath his hand, the surface trembled. Then, for the briefest moment, he felt a faint pushback from within, as if something inside had touched him back. He pulled away sharply, his breath catching. "Did you see that?" he whispered, but Marcus was already closing the outer casing, his hands moving fast. The hum began to fade, replaced by the steady groan of the trees outside swaying under wind. The temperature slowly rose again, though the air still felt wrong, too dense, too saturated with the scent of ozone and metal. Jamal's fingers tingled where he had touched the capsule, a numbness that lingered long after the chill subsided. They secured the container, rebolted the cover, and prepared it for descent. The entire process felt ritualistic now, more caution than method. By the time they lowered it to the forest floor using pulleys and ropes, the sun was already setting. The canopy glowed with an amber hue that matched the liquid inside the capsule, a strange symmetry that made Jamal's stomach twist. At camp, they cleared a space to examine it further. They laid down reflective foil and erected a small tent of transparent plastic, sealing themselves inside with their instruments. Outside, the forest murmured endlessly, but within the barrier, there was only the faint ticking of their equipment. Marcus set up ultraviolet lamps, and Jamal prepared sampling swabs. They began with the exterior, recording temperature, radiation, even atmospheric composition. Everything seemed normal until the instruments began to flicker. The readings jumped unpredictably, spiking with each pulse of the faint hum that still emanated from the capsule. Then came the sound, the same low resonance from the fuselage now surrounding them. It wasn't just from the capsule anymore. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Jamal felt it in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. Marcus staggered back, clutching his ears. The hum subsided as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so complete that their own breathing sounded alien. When Jamal dared to look again, he noticed the insects outside had vanished. The forest had gone utterly still. Even the usual drone of cicadas was gone. He stared through the clear plastic of their shelter into the surrounding darkness and saw movement. Faint glimmers like embers floating among the trees. Tiny lights flickering, rising and falling, tracing paths that seemed deliberate. Fireflies, he thought at first, but these were too uniform, too synchronized. They pulsed together, forming shapes, patterns in the air like coded signals. Marcus, pale and sweating, crouched beside the instruments. "We should shut it down," he said, his voice hoarse. "All of it." But Jamal couldn't look away. The lights outside formed a spiral, expanding slowly, then contracting again. He realized with growing horror that it matched the frequency of the hum they'd recorded. Whatever energy was locked inside the container had spread beyond it. The forest was responding. He turned back to the capsule, his reflection shimmering on its surface. For an instant, the amber fluid inside cleared, revealing the thing suspended within more distinctly than ever before. Its wings unfurled slightly, and beneath them, Something like an eye opened, a single silver orb glinting faintly in the lamp's glow. Jamal stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of tools. The noise broke the moment, and the reflection returned to darkness. Marcus moved first, tearing down the lamps and covering the capsule with the layers of foil. "We're done," he said, his voice shaking. "We document what we can and we leave. Whatever this is, it's beyond us." Jamal wanted to argue, to insist they had found something that could rewrite history, but the look on Marcus's face stopped him. This was not discovery anymore. It was trespass. They stayed awake long into the night, the hum still faintly audible beneath the sounds of the forest. Around them, the lights among the trees continued to move, slow and deliberate, like thoughts passing through a living brain. When dawn came, the insects returned, the air warmed, and the silence lifted. But the memory of the hum lingered, resonating quietly beneath the rhythm of the jungle. As they packed their equipment, Jamal glanced once more at the covered capsule. A small droplet of amber liquid had seeped through a hairline crack near the base. It caught the light, glistening like resin. He wiped it away instinctively with a cloth, but the fabric stuck to his glove, the droplet already hardened into a thin crystalline layer. For a moment, he thought he saw the faintest shimmer of motion beneath it, a microscopic pattern spiraling inward like a seed taking root. He told himself it was nothing, that it was just his imagination. But somewhere deep within the forest, the low hum began again, softer this time, almost indistinguishable from the sound of wind through the leaves, as if the jungle itself had begun to breathe a little differently. By the next morning, the forest seemed changed. The air was thick and luminous, saturated with particles of moisture that refracted the early sunlight into soft, spectral halos. Jamal awoke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though every living thing around them had paused to listen. Even the birds were quiet. Only the slow drip of water from the leaves above marked time. Marcus sat near the remnants of the campfire, staring into the ashes, his expression drawn and hollow. The events of the previous night had carved something deep into both of them. Neither spoke of the hum, or of the light that had pulsed from within the trees, or the way the air had seemed to vibrate with its own hidden heartbeat. The capsule lay beneath a tarp of silver foil at the edge of their camp, inert and cold. Yet both men felt its presence like a weight pressing into the earth. Marcus had barely slept. At dawn, he had begun sorting through the documents and artifacts they'd taken from the plane. The logbook, the torn fragments of maps, the brittle photographs sealed in plastic. Each item was a clue, a fragment of a story that stretched far beyond their understanding. Jamal joined him silently, unfolding the ledger they'd found in the cockpit. The ink had faded further overnight, but the handwriting remained readable enough to reveal new words they had missed before. The final page of the journal, where the pilot's hand had faltered. There, in hurried strokes, were coordinates and a phrase underlined twice. Operation Albatross must remain contained. That word, contained, settled like ice in Jamal's stomach. Whatever had been inside those crates, whatever had caused the crash, it had not been meant for discovery. He ran his fingers over the line, then looked toward the capsule under its cover. The forest beyond was quiet, but he could feel something thrumming in the ground, faint but steady, like the aftershock of a distant engine. Marcus noticed it too. He set down the journal and rubbed his temples. This wasn't transport, he muttered. This was disposal. The hypothesis grew between them over the hours that followed. They sifted through the wreckage of paper and metal, piecing together fragments of a forgotten operation. Project Albatross had not been an ordinary mission. The recovered documents spoke of a biological retrieval unit, a military division tasked with the study and containment of anomalous species. Most of the records were coded, but one typewritten report, still legible, described samples exhibiting adaptive metallic integration and anomalous self-repair. Another mentioned interfacing responses to electromagnetic stimuli. The dates aligned with the final years of World War II, when desperation had driven nations to experiment in directions no one wanted to remember. Marcus worked methodically, his scientific instinct keeping him grounded. He drew a rough timeline of the flight. A classified transport departing from an undisclosed base, destination unknown, crash recorded in the jungle. There were no retrieval missions logged afterward, no mention of recovery in any public record. Whatever the aircraft had carried had been erased from history. Jamal could not help but wonder how many people had died trying to bury it. By midday, the heat returned, and with it the hum. It began so faintly that Jamal mistook it for the echo of distant thunder. But within minutes the vibration coursed through the clearing. The capsule trembled beneath its cover. Marcus leapt to his feet, pulling the tarp aside. The amber liquid inside the sealed core shimmered again, and faint ripples formed on its surface as though something within had begun to stir. Jamal reached for the camera, instinctively documenting every frame even as his pulse raced. The hum deepened, reverberating through the soil, and for a moment the jungle seemed to answer. The trees around them shivered, leaves quivering without wind. The hum shifted in frequency, becoming rhythmic, almost like a pattern of communication. Marcus adjusted the sensors they'd set up nearby, watching as the readings spiked off the scale. "It's reacting," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's feeding off something in the environment." The realization hit Jamal like a flash of light. The capsule was not decaying. It was integrating. The strange metallic filaments they had seen spreading along the fuselage were now appearing at the edges of the clearing. Fine silver threads grew along roots and stones, glistening in the dim light. They seemed to grow faster when touched by shadow, retreating from direct sun only to reemerge thicker moments later. The forest was absorbing whatever energy the capsule emitted. Or perhaps the opposite was true. Perhaps it was the forest that had kept this thing alive all these decades, feeding it through the slow alchemy of decay and renewal. Marcus began packing their samples, his motions frantic. "We have to end this," he said, more to himself than to Jamal. "This isn't preservation, it's contamination." But Jamal was transfixed. He stood staring at the capsule, the words from the logbook echoing in his mind. Containment unstable. Containment implied something alive. He imagined the crew, the panic, the decision to fly low and off course, the realization that they could not land among people. They had chosen the forest, the one place vast enough to swallow their secret whole. As the afternoon wore on, the hum subsided again, but the silence that followed was worse. The air felt charged, the sky overcast and metallic. A storm gathered somewhere beyond the horizon. The colors of the jungle deepened into surreal hues, greens too vivid, shadows too black. Marcus found a half-burned envelope among the papers. Inside was a photograph. 4 men standing in front of the same aircraft, their faces blurred by age and moisture. Behind them, a wooden crate marked Bio Lot C9 sat on the tarmac. One of the men, tall and thin, held a clipboard with a logo half visible in the corner, a symbol of a bird with outstretched wings encircling a double helix. Underneath, a faint caption read, "Fort Detrick, Maryland, 1944. Jamal had heard of the place, a research facility rumored to have conducted biological experiments during the war. He felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. The forest around them had become a living archive of something born in secrecy, something that never should have left its laboratory. He imagined the men who loaded those crates, the silence of orders no one dared question, and the pilot who realized too late that his cargo was alive. They spent the evening decoding the rest of the documents. One fragment mentioned biosynthetic prototypes designed for adaptive replication. Another referenced controlled integration with non-organic ecosystems. The words blurred into nightmare possibilities. Jamal tried to rationalize it. A failed experiment, a primitive attempt at biological engineering, but the evidence before them refused simplification. The capsule had survived 70 years without corrosion, its contents still active, its energy field extending into the environment. It was a creation that defied nature and time, a child of science and war that had found sanctuary in the oldest living organism on Earth. As night descended, strange lights began to appear again beyond the camp's perimeter. This time they were closer, weaving between the trees like small orbs of fire. They moved in spirals, not randomly but with intention. The pattern matched the pulse of the hum, which had returned once more, deeper now, resonating not only through the ground but through their very bones. Marcus crouched beside the instruments, shouting numbers that made no sense, frequencies rising beyond human hearing, magnetic fields fluctuating wildly. Jamal's camera failed, its screen dissolving into static. Then, as suddenly as it began, the hum stopped. The air snapped back to silence. The lights vanished. Marcus slumped against a tree, gasping for breath, his face ashen. Jamal stood motionless, unable to speak. The jungle exhaled again, a long, slow sigh that rustled the leaves and made the soil tremble faintly. He realized then that the forest was not resisting the contamination. It was evolving with it. The metallic veins creeping along the roots were not foreign intrusions, but symbiotic growths, an exchange between creation and host. The thing inside the capsule had not just survived, it had taught the jungle how to live with it. They sat in silence long into the night, the only sound the quiet ticking of rain beginning to fall. Marcus stared into the fire, its light flickering against his hollow features. "If this gets out," he said finally, his voice raw, "it could change everything, not just biology. Everything we think we know about control, about what belongs to us." Jamal nodded slowly. "Maybe it's already out," he said. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the canopy, and in that sound there was rhythm again, a deep, slow cadence like the echo of the hum. Jamal turned toward the forest and thought he saw movement within the downpour, glints of silver tracing the outlines of trees, veins of light pulsing through bark. He blinked, and the vision dissolved into rain. Yet, even as the water hissed over the fire, he could not shake the sense that the forest had been waiting for this storm, that it had learned to listen, to breathe with the rhythm of what the plane had brought to it. Later, when the fire died and the storm faded into mist, Jamal opened his notebook and began to write. His hand trembled, but he forced the words onto paper. "The jungle is remembering." It was the only phrase that fit. He thought of the soldiers, of the plane suspended in the canopy, of the capsule humming like a heart. The men who launched Project Albatross had sought to weaponize life itself, and in doing so, they had awakened something older, something that had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to stir again. When he finally set down the pen, dawn was bleeding through the mist. Marcus was asleep, his body curled near the remnants of the fire. Jamal watched the first light touch the edge of the tarp covering the capsule. It gleamed faintly, as though reflecting the same golden hue that filtered through the trees. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement beneath the cover, a faint shifting, the suggestion of something breathing. He told himself it was the wind, but he knew better. Far above them, the trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering in tones that seemed almost melodic. The forest was alive, but now it sounded different, richer, resonant, with an undertone of metal and memory. The truth lay there, hidden in the hum that neither of them could stop hearing. Project Albatross had not failed. It had simply gone to sleep. And now, awakened by human curiosity, it was remembering what it was meant to become. The first tremor came before dawn, a deep, slow vibration that rolled through the ground like the breath of something enormous. Jamal woke instantly. The earth beneath his hammock was moving, not shaking violently, but pulsing in long, rhythmic waves that made the trees groan in their roots. The air had changed again. It was thicker, metallic, and faintly humming with an energy that prickled against his skin. For a moment, he thought it was thunder, another storm forming beyond the horizon, but when he listened closer, he realized the sound was not from the sky. It came from beneath them, rising through the soil and into the trunks of the trees. The forest was alive in a way it had never been before. Marcus was already awake, crouched near the capsule with a flashlight, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. His voice was low and hoarse. "It's spreading," he said without turning. Jamal followed his gaze. Along the ground near the capsule's base, the metallic filaments they had noticed days earlier had grown thicker, forming small, root-like tendrils that wound across the damp soil. They pulsed faintly with light, veins of silver beneath the earth. Jamal knelt to touch one. It was warm, not hot, but alive with energy. When he pressed his gloved hand closer, the tendril recoiled slightly, like an animal sensing contact. The capsule itself had changed. The amber liquid inside had darkened to a deep gold, and what once had been a single preserved organism now appeared to have fractured. The winged creature's outline was no longer distinct. It had dissolved into the liquid, its body breaking apart into swirling filaments that moved with purpose, forming patterns and shapes that reminded Jamal of neural pathways. It was as if the thing inside was no longer a specimen. It had become something else, something that transcended its form. The thought chilled him, not because it was unnatural, but because it was beautiful. Marcus was moving quickly now, checking the equipment they had left running. Most of the devices were dead, their batteries drained overnight despite being fully charged the evening before. The few that still functioned displayed chaotic readings, magnetic interference, fluctuating temperatures, spikes of unknown frequency. The electromagnetic field around the camp had multiplied tenfold. Jamal could feel it in his bones, a faint vibration that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. The forest around them was no longer separate from the capsule's influence. It had become a part of it. When daylight finally broke, it did not bring relief. The light that filtered through the canopy was tinted green and gold, refracted by a thin mist that hung low to the ground. The forest was strangely quiet again, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath it lay a hum so deep it was almost imperceptible, like the sound of blood moving through veins. Jamal realized that every living thing, the leaves, the moss, the insects, vibrated slightly in time with that rhythm. He and Marcus were standing in the middle of a living organism that had extended itself across the jungle. They decided to climb back to the wreck. The aircraft had become the epicenter of whatever had been awakened, and they needed to see how far the changes had spread. The ascent was harder than before. The trees seemed denser, the air heavy with spores that glistened like dust motes in sunlight. As they climbed, Jamal noticed that the bark of the cebas had developed a strange sheen, a subtle iridescence that shifted in color when the light touched it. It wasn't paint or sap, it was metallic, embedded in the wood itself. The forest was literally transforming, merging with the properties of the substance they had unleashed. When they reached the fuselage, the plane was barely recognizable. Vines had grown over it completely, but the vines themselves had changed color, silver green, as if fused with the same material that coated the capsule. The entire structure pulsed faintly with light. The once dead aircraft seemed to have become a part of the living canopy, its metallic skin breathing alongside the trees. Jamal felt his throat tighten as he stepped inside. The air was cooler, denser, and filled with a faint electric charge that made the hair on his arms stand up. The cargo bay was transformed. The crates that had been stacked neatly days ago were now warped, their wooden frames splitting from within as the contents pushed outward. From the cracks emerged thin, fibrous strands that glowed softly. The walls of the plane were slick with condensation, but when Jamal wiped it away, he saw the condensation was not water. It was something thicker, viscous, and faintly luminescent. The writing on the walls, the faded codes and serial numbers, had begun to disappear, overtaken by fine patterns that resembled circuitry growing across the surface. The plane was no longer decaying. It was evolving. Marcus's voice echoed from the cockpit. "Jamal," he called, "you need to see this." Jamal hurried forward. The control panels, once corroded and broken, were covered in thin metallic filaments that traced over the dials and switches, connecting them in intricate webs. A soft light pulsed through them, following a rhythm that matched the hum. The instruments flickered to life briefly, their needles twitching before settling. The plane was responding to something. Marcus pointed to the windshield. Outside, the canopy shimmered faintly, and for a moment Jamal could see it. The same golden light weaving through the branches, moving upward like a current. "It's communicating," Marcus whispered. "The entire ecosystem is a network now." They descended in silence. Both men knew that whatever was happening was far beyond their control. When they reached the ground, the transformation was even clearer. The metallic growth had spread in all directions, creeping along roots, coating stones, climbing the trunks of smaller trees. Tiny, luminous insects buzzed among the tendrils, their wings reflecting silver light. Jamal realized that they were not normal insects at all. Their bodies shimmered with the same metallic sheen, their flight perfectly synchronized as if directed by a single mind. As evening approached, the air became heavier. The hum deepened again, vibrating through the ground. Jamal's teeth ached from the resonance. Marcus was feverish now, his face pale, sweat running down his temples. He complained of hearing whispers in the sound, fragments of voices that rose and fell like language. At first, Jamal thought it was delirium, but when he listened carefully, he could hear it too. Patterns within the hum, tonal shifts that felt deliberate. It was not noise, it was communication. That night, lightning flashed distantly over the horizon, illuminating the forest in brief, brilliant bursts. Between flashes, Jamal thought he saw movement beyond the trees, something massive shifting in the darkness, the canopy bending as though under invisible weight. The hum grew louder, matching the rhythm of the approaching storm. Then came a sound that froze him where he stood. Metal tearing. The crash site above them had begun to collapse. They ran toward it, the light from their headlamps slicing through mist. When they reached the clearing, they saw the Treetops shuddering, their trunks bending under strain. The weight of the transformed plane had become too great. In slow motion, the fuselage cracked along its spine, metal and wood shrieking together as the vines holding it snapped one by one. Marcus shouted something Jamal didn't hear over the roar. The next moment, the plane fell. It hit the ground in a shower of dirt and shattered branches, breaking apart as though releasing its final breath. The forest absorbed the sound, and then everything went still. Jamal stumbled forward, coughing through clouds of dust. The capsule lay shattered among the wreckage, its outer shell split open. The amber liquid had spilled across the soil, glowing faintly in the darkness. At its center lay the remnants of the creature, or what had been the creature. Its form was no longer recognizable. It was dissolving into the earth, its golden filaments spreading outward like veins through the mud. The glow pulsed in waves that matched the rhythm of the forest's hum. Jamal dropped to his knees, unable to look away. "It's alive," he whispered. "It's merging." Marcus stood motionless beside him, the light from his headlamp reflecting off his pale face. "We need to burn it," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Now, before it reaches everything." He moved towards the wreck, pulling the emergency flares from his pack. Jamal hesitated, torn between fear and awe. What if the thing was not spreading destruction but evolution? What if this was nature's next step, a synthesis of life and metal, born from the ashes of human arrogance? But before he could speak, Marcus lit the flare. The fire spread quickly, climbing the vines, licking across the spilled fluid. For a brief moment, the light of the flames seemed to fight against the golden glow. The hum grew louder, a deep resonance that shook the air. Then, something unexpected happened. The fire turned silver. The flames stopped consuming and began to pulse, the same rhythmic motion that now defined everything around them. The substance was not burning, it was adapting. Marcus dropped the flare, stumbling backward. "It's using it," he gasped. "It's feeding on it." The light spread, racing up the trunks of the nearest trees, tracing their veins in molten gold. Jamal could feel the heat radiating from the ground, though it was not burning, just pure, raw energy. The forest was alive in a way that defied comprehension. Every root, every leaf, every drop of rain shimmered with metallic light. They ran until their lungs burned. Behind them, the forest glowed faintly, the pulse slowing, softening, as though it had absorbed what it needed. When they finally stopped at the riverbank, the night was eerily calm again. The glow had retreated into the canopy, hidden but still present, its rhythm echoing through the water. Marcus sank to his knees, staring at his hands. Fine specks of silver glistened on his skin, embedded like dust. Jamal looked at his own palms and saw the same shimmer. The forest had marked them. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The jungle had awakened, and in doing so, it had rewritten the laws they thought immutable. The Treetops still stood tall above the mist, their branches glowing faintly as the hum faded into the distance. It was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something vast and silent, born in secrecy and now part of the world. The forest breathed, patient and endless, and the remnants of Project Albatross pulsed quietly beneath its roots, waiting for whatever came next. When Jamal opened his eyes, Dawn was a blur of pale smoke and light, a world stripped of shape and sound. For a long moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The air tasted of ash and damp metal, and the ground beneath him was soft, trembling with the faintest pulse. Then memory flooded back. The fire that had turned silver, the forest blazing without burning, the hum that had shaken the world like a heartbeat inside the earth. He turned his head slowly and saw Marcus lying a few feet away on the muddy riverbank, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dried sweat and soot. He was breathing, shallow but steady. Beyond him, the jungle glimmered in silence, the trees ghostly in the morning mist. The forest was different now. It no longer hummed, no longer whispered, no longer reached toward them with invisible tendrils of energy. It was still, unnaturally still, like an animal that had gone to sleep after feeding. Yet, even in its quiet, Jamal could sense life all around, coiled and awake beneath the surface. The Saibas stood like colossal sentinels in the fog, their trunks streaked with silver veins that caught the dim light. The air shimmered faintly, thick with particles that reflected like dust motes of light. It was beautiful and terrifying. Jamal pushed himself upright, every muscle screaming in protest. His backpack was gone, swept away by the chaos of the night, but the field notebook was still in his jacket pocket, damp but intact. He opened it with shaken hands. The last line he had written, "The jungle is remembering," blurred where the ink had run. Beneath it, he began a new entry, words scratching across the page in uneven lines. Fire ineffective, containment impossible. Marcus alive, forest transformed. He paused, staring at the words. They felt meaningless, hollow in the face of what he had witnessed. The forest had not been destroyed, it had adapted. The experiment, buried for decades, had become part of the natural world, and there was no undoing it. Marcus stirred, coughing weakly. Jamal crawled over to him. His friend's skin glistened faintly, as though fine dust clung to every pore. It wasn't ash, it was metallic, tiny flecks of silver embedded in his sweat. Jamal wiped his own face and found the same shimmer. The air itself seemed to cling to them, marking them as part of the phenomenon. Marcus opened his eyes slowly. For a moment, they reflected the same faint gold light that shimmered through the forest, then faded back to their normal brown. "Where are we?" he rasped. "Downstream," Jamal said. "We ran last night. I think the plane's gone." Marcus struggled to sit up, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Gone," he repeated softly, though his tone wasn't one of relief. "Or buried." They sat in silence, listening to the forest breathe. Every sound was muffled, dampened by the thick mist. Even the river beside them seemed subdued, its current slower than before, as if resisting motion. Jamal tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. The exhaustion ran deeper than muscle. It was something in the air, a fatigue that felt shared between them and the living world around. When he finally managed to steady himself, he saw something glinting half buried near the water's edge, a fragment of metal, twisted and blackened by fire. He knelt to examine it. It was a piece of the fuselage, still warm to the touch despite the cool air. Embedded within its surface were delicate veins of silver that pulsed faintly like veins in living flesh. Marcus joined him, his expression hardening. "It's in everything now," he said. "The trees, the soil, the water." He paused, glancing toward the forest. "Maybe even us." Jamal didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The line between human and environment had already blurred the moment they touched that capsule. He closed his notebook, slipped it back into his pocket, and stared into the fog where the jungle disappeared into endless green. Somewhere out there lay the wreckage, the source of all this. And though every instinct screamed to leave, another part of him knew they couldn't. Not yet. They needed proof. If they left with only words, no one would believe them. By midday, the fog lifted, revealing the vast sprawl of the rainforest shimmering in the light. The colors were different now. The greens were deeper, darker, tinged with a metallic luster that hadn't been there before. The air vibrated faintly when the wind passed through the leaves, as though sound itself had changed. They moved slowly, following the river upstream, retracing their path toward the crash site. Each step was laborious, the heat oppressive, but they pressed on, guided by a mixture of duty and dread. Hours passed before the first sign of what they sought appeared: a charred trunk, its bark fused with streaks of molten metal that had cooled into strange geometric shapes. Then another. The trail of destruction grew denser until they emerged into the clearing where the plane had fallen. Jamal stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The clearing was unrecognizable. The wreckage was gone, not scattered or burned, but absorbed. The ground was covered in a carpet of new growth, roots and vines interwoven with strips of dull silver. Where the plane had once stood, a mound had formed, shaped vaguely like a cocoon, its surface smooth and glistening as if still wet. It pulsed faintly under the sunlight. Marcus approached slowly, his boots sinking into the soft soil. "It's regenerating," he whispered, "or reproducing." Jamal crouched near the mound, touching the surface with the tip of his glove. It was warm, almost hot. Beneath the smooth exterior, something shifted. Slow, deliberate movement, like breath. He drew back quickly. "We can't stay here," he said. "Whatever this is, it's not done." Marcus didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the structure, mesmerized. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. Jamal listened. At first, there was only the wind, the faint rustle of leaves. Then he heard it, the hum again, faint but distinct, rising from the ground in low, rhythmic waves. It was not chaotic this time. It was steady, measured, almost soothing, and beneath it, barely audible, something else, a pattern, tones rising and falling in repetition, like a heartbeat forming language. "Coordinates," Marcus murmured. "Those are coordinates." He fumbled for his recorder, pressing the microphone toward the mound. The device crackled, its indicator light flickering weakly. "It's transmitting data. It's trying to communicate." Jamal's mind raced. If Marcus was right, this wasn't a natural transformation. It was an intelligent one. The forest, the plane, the experiment, they had fused into a single organism capable of transmitting signals. The implications were beyond comprehension. He imagined the sound traveling through the soil, through roots and rivers, carried across miles of rainforest until it reached places humans could no longer follow. The hum intensified, vibrating through their bones. Marcus staggered backward, clutching his head. "It's too loud," he gasped. Jamal grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the mound. They stumbled through the trees, the sound growing softer as they fled. When they finally stopped, the jungle behind them had gone silent again, as if closing its mouth. Jamal leaned against a tree, his pulse hammering. Marcus collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard. "We need to leave," he said, "now, before it spreads any further." They followed the river again, moving downstream for hours until the sound of helicopter rotors broke the silence. Jamal looked up and saw a black shape cutting through the clouds, a search team. He waved his arms weakly. The chopper descended, the wind from its blades scattering leaves like a storm. The rescue crew lifted them aboard, shouting questions neither man could answer. As the helicopter rose above the canopy, Jamal looked down one last time. From this height, the jungle looked ordinary, an endless sea of green. But beneath the surface, faint lines of silver light traced the veins of the forest, pulsing slowly, spreading outward in all directions. Days blurred into weeks. Hospitals, debriefings, sterile rooms filled with men in suits asking questions they weren't supposed to answer. Marcus spoke less with each interview. His eyes grew distant, his responses mechanical. Jamal sensed that the authorities already knew more than they pretended. Project Albatross had never died. It had been waiting, buried beneath time and secrecy, and now that it had been found, it belonged to them again. The university revoked their research licenses under the guise of protocol violations. The samples they had recovered were confiscated, their equipment seized. Jamal returned to his apartment in Atlanta, hollow and restless. Every night he dreamed of the forest, the glow beneath the leaves, the hum beneath his skin. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced he could hear it through the walls, faint and distant, a pulse traveling across the world. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, only a single line printed neatly on heavy paper. Do not speak. It is contained. Beneath it was a set of numbers, coordinates. They were not the ones from the wreckage. They pointed to a new location, hundreds of miles away, deeper into the Amazon. Marcus disappeared soon after. His apartment was empty, his belongings untouched except for a single notebook left on the table. Inside, in his handwriting, were 3 words repeated over and over. It remembers us. Years passed. Jamal never returned to the forest, but the memory never faded. Sometimes, when storms rolled through the city, he would hear it again. The low, steady hum that no machine could reproduce. He would close his eyes and see the ceiba's glowing, the silver veins pulsing beneath the soil, the capsule dissolving into the heart of the jungle. And though he tried to tell himself it was imagination, he knew better. The thing they had awakened was not gone. It had simply grown quiet, waiting. Late one night, unable to sleep, he opened his old field notebook. Between the ruined pages was a small, hardened fragment he didn't remember saving, a shard of resin, faintly translucent, with a tiny metallic thread running through it like a vein. As he turned it in the light, it pulsed once, faintly, almost imperceptibly. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the familiar rhythm echo in his chest. The jungle had sent him a reminder. Outside his window, the city lights flickered as thunder rolled across the horizon. For a brief moment, the street lamps dimmed in unison, then flared back to life. Jamal held the fragment in his palm, listening to the distant hum that only he could hear. Somewhere out there, deep beneath the endless canopy of the Amazon, the forest was still breathing, alive, awake, and remembering the men who had stirred it from its sleep. If you want to know what else they discovered deep in the Amazon, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Watch the next videos for more unbelievable real stories, and share this one with someone who loves mysteries that were never meant to be found.